2. The afternoon was like the center of the cake that Bernice had baked last Monday, a cake which failed. The old Frankie had been glad the cake had failed, not out of spite, but because she loved these fallen cakes the best. She enjoyed the damp, gummy richness near the center, and did not understand why grown people thought such cakes a failure. It was a loaf cake, that last Monday, with the edges risen light and high, and the middle moist and altogether fallen. After the bright high morning, the afternoon was dense and solid as the center of that cake. And because it was the last of all the afternoons, Jasmine found an unfamiliar sweetness in the known old kitchen ways and tones. At 2 o'clock, when she came in, Bernice was pressing clothes. John Henry sat at the table blowing soap bubbles with a spool, and he gave her a long, green, secret look. "Where in the world have you been?" asked Bernice. "We know something you don't know," John Henry said. "Do you know what?" "What?" "Bernice and me are going to the wedding." Jasmine was taking off her organdy dress, and his words startled her. "Uncle Charles is dead." "I heard that, but—" "Yes," said Bernice. "Poor old soul passed on this morning. They're taking his body to the family graveyard in Opelika, and John Henry is to stay with us for several days." Now that she knew the death of Uncle Charles would, in a sense, affect the wedding, she made room for it in her thoughts. While Bernice finished pressing clothes, Jasmine sat in her petticoat on the stairs leading up to her room. She closed her eyes. Uncle Charles lived in a shady wooden house out in the country, and he was too old to eat corn on the cob. In June of this summer, he took sick, and ever since he had been critical. He lay in the bed, shrunken and brown and very old. He complained that the pictures were hung crooked on the wall, and they took down all the framed pictures. It was not that. He complained that his bed was placed in a wrong corner, so they moved the bed. It was not that. Then his voice failed, and when he tried to talk, it was as though his throat had filled with glue, and they could not understand the words. One Sunday, the Wests had gone out to see him and taken Frankie with them. She had tiptoed to the open door of the back bedroom. He looked like an old man carved in brown wood and covered with a sheet. Only his eyes had moved, and they were like blue jelly, and she had felt they might come out from the sockets and roll like blue wet jelly down his stiff face. She had stood in the doorway staring at him, then tiptoed away, afraid. They finally made out that he complained the sun shone the wrong way through the window, but that was not the thing that hurt him so. And it was death. Jasmine opened her eyes and stretched herself. "It is a terrible thing to be dead," she said. "Well," said Bernice, "the old man suffered a lot, and he had lived up his span. The Lord appointed the time for him." "I know, but at the same time it seems mighty queer that he would have to die the very day before the wedding. And why on earth do you and John Henry have to go tagging to the wedding? Seems to me like you would just stay home." "Frankie Adams," said Bernice. Then she suddenly put her arms akimbo. "You are the most selfish human being that ever breathed. We all been cooped up in this kitchen and—" "Don't call me Frankie," she said. "I don't wish to have to remind you any more." It was the time of early afternoon, when in the old days a sweet band would be playing. Now, with the radio turned off, the kitchen was solemn and silent, and there were sounds from far away. A colored voice called from the sidewalk, calling the names of vegetables in a dark, slurred tone, a long, unwinding hollering in which there were no words. Somewhere, near in the neighborhood, there was the sound of a hammer, and each stroke left a round echo. "You would be mighty surprised if you knew where all I've been today. I was all over this town. I saw the monkey and the monkey man, and there was a soldier who was trying to buy the monkey and holding $100 in his hand. Have you ever seen anybody try to buy a monkey on the street?" "No. Was he drunk?" Drunk? F. Jasmine asked. Oh, said John Henry, the monkey and the monkey man. Bernice's question had disturbed F. Jasmine, and she took a minute to consider. I don't think he was drunk. People don't get drunk in broad daylight. She had meant to tell Bernice about the soldier, but now she hesitated. All the same, there was something. Her voice trailed at the end, and she watched a rainbow soap bubble floating in silence across the room. Here in the kitchen, barefooted and wearing only her petticoat, it was hard to realize and judge the soldier. About the promise for that evening, she felt double-minded. The indecision bothered her, and so she changed the subject. I hope you washed and ironed everything good of mine today. I have to take them to Winter Hill. What for? Said Bernice. You only gonna be there just one day. You heard me, F. Jasmine said. I told you I wasn't coming back here after the wedding. Fool's Hill, you have a whole lot less sense than I was giving you credit for. What makes you think they want to take you along with them? 2 is company, and 3 is a crowd. And that is the main thing about a wedding. 2 is company, and 3 is a crowd. F. Jasmine always found it hard to argue with a known saying. She loved to use them in her shows and in her conversation, but they were very hard to argue with, and so she said, You wait and see. Remember back to the time of the flood. Remember Noah and the ark. And what has that got to do with it? She asked. Remember the way he admitted them creatures? Oh, hush up your big old mouth, she said. 2 by 2, said Bernice. He admitted them creatures 2 by 2. The argument that afternoon was, from the beginning to the end, about the wedding. Bernice refused to follow F. Jasmine's frame of mind. From the first, it was as though she tried to catch F. Jasmine by the collar, like the law catches a no-good in the wrong, and jerk her back where she had started, back to the sad and crazy summer that now seemed to F. Jasmine like a time remembered from long ago. But F. Jasmine was stubborn and not to be caught. Bernice had flaws to find in all of her ideas, and from the first word to the last, she did her terrible level best to try and deny the wedding. But F. Jasmine would not let it be denied. Look, F. Jasmine said, and she picked up the pink organdy dress that she had just taken off. Remember when I bought this dress, the collar had teeny little pleats, but you've been ironing the collar like it was supposed to be ruffled. Now we got to set those little pleats like they ought to be. And who's going to do it? Said Bernice. She picked up the dress and judged the collar. I got more to do with my time and trouble. Well, it's got to be done, F. Jasmine argued. It's the way the collar is supposed to be. And besides, I might be wearing it out somewhere this evening. And where, pray tell me, said Bernice. Answer the question I asked when you came in. Where in the world have you been all morning? It was exactly as F. Jasmine had known it would be, the way Bernice refused to understand. And since it was more a matter of feeling than of words or facts, she found it difficult to explain. When she spoke of connections, Bernice gave her a long, uncomprehending stare. And when she went on to the blue moon and the many people, the broad flat nose of Bernice widened and she shook her head. F. Jasmine did not mention the soldier, although she was on the verge of speaking of him several times. Something warned her not to. When she had finished, Bernice said, Frankie, I honestly believe you have turned crazy on us, walking around all over town, telling total strangers this big tale. You know in your soul this mania of yours is pure foolishness. You wait and see, F. Jasmine said. They will take me. And if they don't? F. Jasmine picked up the shoebox with the silver slippers and the wrap box with the wedding dress. These are my wedding clothes. I'll show them to you later. And if they don't? F. Jasmine had already started up the stairs, but she stopped and turned back toward the kitchen. The room was silent. If they don't, I will kill myself, she said. But they will. Kill yourself how? Asked Bernice. I will shoot myself in the side of the head with a pistol. Which pistol? The pistol that Papa keeps under his handkerchiefs along with Mother's picture in the right-hand bureau drawer. Bernice did not answer for a minute, and her face was a puzzle. You heard what Mr. Adams told you about playing with that pistol. Go on upstairs now. Dinner will be ready in a little while. It was a late dinner, this last meal that the three of them would ever eat together at the kitchen table. On Saturdays they were not regular about the times of meals, and they began the dinner at 4 o'clock, when already the August sun was slanting long and stale across the yard. It was the time of afternoon when the bars of sunlight crossed the backyard like the bars of a bright, strange jail. The 2 fig trees were green and flat, the arbor sun-crossed and casting solid shade. The sun in the afternoon did not slant through the back windows of the house, so that the kitchen was gray. The three of them began their dinner at 4 o'clock, and the dinner lasted until twilight. There was Hopping John cooked with the ham bone, and as they ate they began to talk of love. It was a subject F. Jasmine had never talked about in all her life. In the first place, she had never believed in love, and had never put any of it in her shows. But this afternoon, when Bernice began this conversation, F. Jasmine did not stop up both her ears, but as she quietly ate the peas and rice and pot liquor, she listened. I have heard of many a queer thing, said Bernice. I have knew men to fall in love with girls so ugly that you wonder if their eyes is straight. I have seen some of the most peculiar weddings anybody could conjecture. Once, I knew a boy with his whole face burned off so that... Who? Asked John Henry. Bernice swallowed a piece of cornbread and wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. I have knew women's to love veritable Satans and thank Jesus when they put their split hooves over the threshold. I have knew boys to take it into their heads to fall in love with other boys. You know Lily Mae Jenkins? F. Jasmine thought a minute and then answered, I'm not sure. Well, you either know him or you don't know him. He prisses around with a pink satin blouse and one arm akimbo. Now, this Lily Mae fell in love with a man named Junie Jones. A man, mind you. And Lily Mae turned into a girl. He changed his nature and his sex and turned into a girl. Honest? F. Jasmine asked. Did he really? He did, said Bernice, to all intents and purposes. F. Jasmine scratched behind her ear and said, It's funny, I can't think who you were talking about. I used to think I knew so many people. Well, you don't need to know Lily Mae Jenkins. You can live without knowing him. Anyway, I don't believe you, F. Jasmine said. Well, I ain't arguing with you, said Bernice. What was it we was speaking about? About peculiar things. Oh, yes. They stopped off a few minutes to get on with the dinner. F. Jasmine ate with her elbows on the table and her bare heels hooked on the rungs of the chair. She and Bernice sat opposite each other, and John Henry faced the window. Now, Hopping John was F. Jasmine's favorite food. She had always warned them to wave a plate of rice and peas before her nose when she was in her coffin to make certain there was no mistake. For if a breath of life was left in her, she would sit up and eat. But if she smelled the Hopping John and did not stir, then they could just nail down the coffin and be certain she was truly dead. Now Bernice had chosen for her death test a piece of fried freshwater trout, and for John Henry it was divinity fudge. But though F. Jasmine loved the Hopping John the very best, the others also liked it well enough, and all three of them enjoyed the dinner that day. The ham knuckle, the Hopping John, cornbread, hot-baked sweet potatoes, and the buttermilk. And as they ate, they carried on the conversation. Yes, as I was just telling you, said Bernice, I have seen many a peculiar thing in my day, and one thing I never knew and never heard tell about. No, sir, I never did. Bernice stopped talking and sat there shaking her head, waiting for them to question her. But F. Jasmine would not speak, and it was John Henry who raised his curious face from his plate and asked, "What, Bernice?" "No," said Bernice. "I never before in all my days heard of anybody falling in love with a wedding. I have knew many peculiar things, but I have never heard of that before." F. Jasmine grumbled something. "So I have been thinking it over and have come to a conclusion." "How?" John Henry suddenly asked. "How did that boy change into a girl?" Bernice glanced at him and straightened the napkin tied around his neck. "It was just one of them things, Candy Lamb. I don't know." "Don't listen to her," F. Jasmine said. "So I've been thinking it over in my mind and come to this conclusion. What you ought to be thinking about is a beau." "What?" Jasmine asked. "You heard me," said Bernice. "A beau. A nice little white boy beau." F. Jasmine put down her fork and sat with her head turned to one side. "I don't want any beau. What would I do with one?" "Do? Foolish," asked Bernice. "Why, make him treat you to the picture show, for one thing." F. Jasmine pulled the bangs of her hair down over her forehead and slid her feet across the rung of the chair. "Now you belong to change from being so rough and greedy and big," said Bernice. "You ought to fix yourself up nice in your dresses, and speak sweetly and act sly." F. Jasmine said in a low voice, "I'm not rough and greedy any more. I already changed that way." "Well, excellent," said Bernice. "Now catch you a beau." F. Jasmine wanted to tell Bernice about the soldier, the hotel, and the invitation for the evening date. But something checked her, and she hinted around the edges of the subject. "What kind of a beau? Do you mean something like—" If Jasmine paused, for at home in the kitchen that last afternoon, the soldier seemed unreal. "Now that I cannot advise," said Bernice. "You got to decide for yourself." "Something like a soldier who would maybe take me dancing at the idle hour?" She did not look at Bernice. "Who is talking about soldiers and dancing? I'm talking about a nice little white boy beau, your own age. How about that little old Barney?" "Barney McKean?" "Why, certainly. He would do very well to begin with. You could make out with him until somebody else comes along. He would do." "That mean, nasty Barney?" The garage had been dark, with thin, needling sunlight coming through the cracks of the closed door and with the smell of dust. But she did not let herself remember the unknown sin that he had showed her, that later made her want to throw a knife between his eyes. Instead, she shook herself hard and began mashing peas and rice together on her plate. "You are the biggest crazy in this town." "The crazy calls the sane the crazy." So they began to eat again, all except John Henry. F. Jasmine was busy slicing open cornbread and spreading it with butter and mashing her hopping john and drinking milk. Bernice ate more slowly, peeling off bits of ham from the knuckle in a dainty way. John Henry looked from one of them to the other, and after listening to their talk, he had stopped eating to think for a little while. Then, after a minute, he asked, "How many of them did you catch, them beaux?" "How many?" said Bernice. "Lamb, how many hairs is in these plates? You talking to Bernice Sadie Brown." So Bernice was started, and her voice went on and on. And when she had begun this way on a long and serious subject, the words flowed one into the other, and her voice began to sing. In the gray of the kitchen, on summer afternoons, the tone of her voice was golden and quiet, and you could listen to the color in the singing of her voice and not follow the words. F. Jasmine let the long tones linger and spin inside her ears, but her mind did not stamp the voice with sense or sentences. She sat there listening at the table, and now and then she thought of a fact that all her life had seemed to her most curious. Bernice always spoke of herself as though she was somebody very beautiful. Almost on this one subject, Bernice was really not in her right mind. F. Jasmine listened to the voice and stared at Bernice across the table. The dark face with the wild blue eye, the 11 greased plates that fitted her head like a skull cap, the wide, flat nose that quivered as she spoke. And whatever else Bernice might be, she was not beautiful. It seemed to her she ought to give Bernice advice. So she said at the next pause, I think you ought to quit worrying about beaux and be content with TT. I bet you are 40 years old. It's time for you to settle down. Bernice bunched up her lips and stared at F. Jasmine with a dark, live eye. Wise mouth, she said. How do you know so much? I got as much right as anybody else to continue to have a good time as long as I can. And as far as that goes, I'm not so old as some people would try and make out. I can still ministrate, and I got many a long year ahead of me before I resign myself to a corner. Well, I didn't mean go into a corner, F. Jasmine said. I heard what you meant, said Bernice. John Henry had been watching and listening, and there was a little crust of pot liquor around his mouth. A big, blue, lazy fly was hovering around him and trying to light on his sticky face, so that from time to time John Henry waved his hand to shoo the fly away. Did they all treat you to the picture show? He asked. All those bulls? To the show or to one thing or another, she answered. You mean you never pay your own way? John Henry asked. That's what I'm telling you, said Bernice. Not when I go out with a beau. Now, if I was to go somewhere with a crowd of women's, I would have to pay my way. But I'm not the kind of person to go around with crowds of women's. When you all took the trip to Fairview, F. Jasmine said, for one Sunday that last spring, there had been a colored pilot who took up colored people in his airplane. Who paid the way? Now, let me see, said Bernice. Honey and Chlorina took care of their expenses, except I loaned Honey $1.40. Cape Clyde paid his own way, and T.T. paid for himself and for me. Then T.T. treated you to the airplane ride? That's what I'm telling you. He paid the bus tickets to and from Fairview, and the airplane ride, and the refreshments, the complete trip. Why, naturally he paid the way. How else do you think I could afford to fly around in an airplane, me making $6 a week? I didn't realize that, F. Jasmine admitted finally. I wonder where T.T. got all of his money. Earned it, said Bernice. John Henry, wipe off your mouth. So they rested at the table, for the way they ate their meals this summer was in rounds. They would eat a while and then let the food have a chance to spread out and settle inside their stomachs, and a little later they would start in again. F. Jasmine crossed her knife and fork on her empty plate and began to question Bernice about a matter that had bothered her. Tell me, is it just us who call this Hoppin' John? Or is it known by that name through all the country? It seems a strange name somehow. Well, I've heard it called various things, said Bernice. What? Well, I've heard it called peas and rice, or rice and peas, and pot liquor, or Hoppin' John. You can vary and take your pick. But I'm not talking about this town, F. Jasmine said. I mean in other places. I mean through all the world. I wonder what the French call it. Oh, said Bernice. Well, you asked me a question I cannot answer. Merci à la parler, F. Jasmine said. They sat at the table and did not speak. F. Jasmine was tilted back in her chair, her head turned toward the window, and the sun-crossed empty yard. The town was silent, and the kitchen was silent except for the clock. F. Jasmine could not feel the world go round, and nothing moved. Now, a funny thing has happened to me, F. Jasmine began. I don't hardly know how to tell just what I mean. It was one of those strange things you can't exactly explain. What, Frankie? John Henry asked. F. Jasmine turned from the window, but before she could speak again, there was the sound. In the silence of the kitchen, they heard the tone shaft quietly across the room. Then again, the same note was repeated. A piano scale slanted across the August afternoon. A chord was struck. Then, in a dreaming way, a chain of chords climbed slowly upward like a flight of castle stairs. But just at the end, when the eighth chord should have sounded and the scale made complete, there was a stop. This next to the last chord was repeated, the seventh chord, which seems to echo all of the unfinished scale, struck and insisted again and again. And finally, there was a silence. F. Jasmine and John Henry and Bernice looked at each other. Somewhere in the neighborhood, an August piano was being tuned. Jesus, said Bernice, I seriously believe this will be the last straw. John Henry shivered. Me too, he said. F. Jasmine sat perfectly still before the table crowded with plates and dinner dishes. The gray of the kitchen was a stale gray, and the room was too flat and too square. After the silence, another note was sounded, and then repeated an octave higher. F. Jasmine raised her eyes each time the tone climbed higher, as though she watched the note move from one part of the kitchen to another. At the highest point, her eyes had reached a ceiling corner. Then, when a long scale slid downward, her head turned slowly as her eyes crossed from the ceiling corner to the floor corner at the opposite side of the room. The bottom bass note was struck 6 times, and F. Jasmine was left staring at an old pair of bedroom slippers and an empty beer bottle which were in that corner of the room. Finally, she shut her eyes and shook herself and got up from the table. It makes me sad, F. Jasmine said, and jittery too. She began to walk around the room. They tell me that when they want to punish them over in Milledgeville, they tie them up and make them listen to piano tuning. She walked 3 times around the table. There's something I want to ask you. Suppose you ran into somebody who seemed to you terribly peculiar, but you didn't know the reason why. In what way peculiar? F. Jasmine thought of the soldier, but she could not further explain. Say you might meet somebody you think he almost might be a drunk, but you're not sure about anything, and he wanted you to join with him and go to a big party or dance. What would you do? Well, on the face of it, I don't know. It would depend on how I feel. I might go with him to the big party and meet up with somebody that suited me better. The live eye of Bernice suddenly narrowed, and she looked hard at F. Jasmine. But why do you ask that? The quietness in the room stretched out until F. Jasmine could hear the drip-drop from the faucet of the sink. She was trying to frame a way to tell Bernice about the soldier. Then all at once the telephone rang. F. Jasmine jumped up and turned over her empty milk glass, dashed to the hall, but John Henry, who was nearer, reached the telephone first. He knelt on the telephone chair and smiled into the mouthpiece before he said hello. Then he kept on saying hello until F. Jasmine took the receiver from him and repeated the hellos at least 24 times before she finally hung up. Anything like that makes me so mad, she said when they had gone back to the kitchen. Or when the express truck stops before the door and the man peers at our number and then he takes the box somewhere else. I look on those things as a kind of sign. She raked her fingers through her crew-cut blonde hair. You know, I'm really going to get my fortune told before I leave home in the morning. It's something I've been meaning to do for a long time. Bernice said, changing the subject, when are you going to show me the new dress? I'm anxious to see what you selected. So F. Jasmine went up to get the dress. Her room was what was known as a hot box. The heat from the rest of the house rose up to her room and stayed there. In the afternoon, the air seemed to make a buzzing sound, so it was a good idea to keep the motor running.